Iran is now confronting one of the most severe water emergencies in its modern history, and experts increasingly describe the situation as nothing less than water bankruptcy. This phrase is not poetic exaggeration. It is a technical warning that Iran is consuming far more water than it can naturally replenish, even in its best rainfall years. Although extreme heat, poor rainfall and climate change certainly worsen the problem, the deeper truth is that Iran's water crisis is overwhelmingly man-made. It is the result of decades of policy decisions, political incentives, unsustainable agricultural strategies, overpumping, misplaced industrial construction, and infrastructure projects that often worked against natural ecological systems. The drought is real, but the scale of the disaster was built by human hands. Iran's geography has always been challenging. Much of the country consists of deserts or semi-arid lands. Rainfall is scarce. Evaporation rates are among the highest in the world, and only a few regions receive consistent moisture. For thousands of years, Iranian civilizations adapted to this climate through systems like qanats, gently sloping underground channels that transported water from mountains to farms and settlements without major losses. These systems allowed agriculture and settlement to flourish despite the harsh environment, and they represented a harmony between human needs and natural limitations. But over the past several decades, as Iran modernized, urbanized, and industrialized, the balance that sustained the region for centuries was fundamentally disrupted. Political visions of national strength and self-reliance became deeply intertwined with water use. After the Iran-Iraq War, successive governments pushed a goal that resonated emotionally and politically: food self-sufficiency. Leaders envisioned an Iran that would not need to rely on foreign wheat, rice, or sugar, a nation proudly feeding itself despite sanctions or external pressure. But the policy ignored the environmental reality of the country. Iran began promoting water-intensive crops across regions that lacked the water to support them. Farmers were incentivized to grow wheat, rice, sugar, beet, and alfalfa in areas with minimal rainfall and fragile water tables. Because the government heavily subsidized electricity and fuel, pumping groundwater was cheap. Because water was priced far below its true value, there was no incentive to conserve. And because political narratives emphasized expansion rather than sustainability, very few officials raised alarms about the long-term consequences. The result was predictable but devastating. Agriculture began to consume nearly 90% of Iran's total water supply, an almost unimaginable percentage. Most farms still used flood irrigation, an archaic method that wastes enormous quantities of water by letting it run over fields rather than delivering precise amounts directly to plant roots. Despite occasional pilot programs encouraging drip irrigation, adoption remained low. The entire structure rewarded overuse, not conservation. By the late 2000s, groundwater levels in many provinces had already plunged to critical levels. Wells that once reached aquifers within a few meters now had to drill dozens of meters deeper. In some regions, water tables have dropped more than 50 meters in a single generation. Experts warn that nearly 70% of Iran's groundwater reserves have been depleted, much of it permanently. Alongside legal wells, tens of thousands of illegal ones emerged. Many were drilled by desperate farmers trying to save their livelihoods, but others were created by powerful interest groups or local networks operating outside of regulation. Officials sometimes tried to crack down, but political pressure and fear of rural unrest led to weak enforcement. Over time, illegal wells became so widespread that shutting them all down became nearly impossible. This widespread, uncontrolled extraction caused irreversible damage. Aquifers collapsed. Soils became saline and infertile, and vast areas of land began to sink. In some parts of Iran, land subsidence has reached catastrophic levels, damaging roads, buildings, and even historical sites. This is not the temporary stress of a drought. It is long-term ecological destruction that could take centuries to reverse. At the same time, Iran pursued an aggressive dam-building policy that dramatically altered natural water systems Hundreds of dams were built across the country, often celebrated as symbols of national development, power and technological achievement. But many dams were constructed on seasonal rivers or in basins that could not support large-scale storage. In Iran's hot climate, shallow reservoirs lose enormous volumes of water to evaporation. Some estimates suggest up to 40% in a single year. These dams also disrupted natural river flow, starving wetlands, lakes, and downstream communities of the water they depended on. Lake Urmia, once the largest saltwater lake in the Middle East, shrank dramatically, turning into a global example of how infrastructure projects can accelerate ecological collapse. Other rivers, such as the Zayande Rud in Isfahan, saw their flow interrupted to the point that historic riverbeds ran dry for years. In addition to misguided agricultural and dam policies, the placement of certain industries also worsened the crisis. Heavy industries like steel mills, petrochemical plants, and mining operations were built in some of Iran's driest provinces in an effort to create local jobs and stimulate regional development. These industries require massive amounts of water to function, yet they were sited in regions where natural water availability was already minimal. Instead of being built near coastal areas where desalination could have been used, factories were constructed inland, where they competed directly with farmers and households for dwindling water supplies. This decision was economically appealing in the short term, but environmentally disastrous in the long term. Compounding all these problems is a governance structure that is fragmented and often contradictory. Water policy in Iran is divided among multiple ministries and agencies, each with overlapping jurisdictions and competing priorities. Agricultural authorities often push for expanded crop production, while environmental agencies warn that available water cannot support such growth. Regional officials demand water transfers to support local economies, even when those transfers harm neighbouring regions or violate environmental guidelines. Illegal wells go unregulated, data sharing is inconsistent, and long-term planning is often overshadowed by immediate political or economic pressures. Environmental voices have historically had limited influence, and policies are often shaped by short-term needs rather than ecological reality. Climate change has dramatically intensified every one of these structural weaknesses. Iran today faces hotter summers, more erratic rainfall, and longer drought cycles. Seasonal patterns that once brought relief to certain regions have become unreliable. Many of the country's most important dams are now at historically low levels, and cities in several provinces have warned that they may face severe rationing. But although climate change has accelerated the pace of decline, it did not create the underlying vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities were created by decades of decisions that treated water as an infinite resource in a country where it was always scarce. The social consequences are already visible. Protests over water shortages have erupted in cities such as Isfahan and Khuzestan, where farmers block highways demanding water that has run dry. Urban residents complain about rationing, low water pressure, or contaminated supplies. Rural families are increasingly migrating to cities after their wells dry up, adding pressure to already strained urban systems. Water scarcity affects not just agriculture, but electricity, industry, public health, and food security. It influences internal migration patterns, job markets, and even political stability. Analysts warn that water stress is emerging as one of the defining national security issues of Iran's future, as significant as energy, sanctions, or regional geopolitics. The concept of water bankruptcy captures the scale of the problem. Iran has created a system in which demand for water far exceeds supply, not temporarily, but structurally. Even if rainfall increases for several years, it will not refill the aquifers that have been emptied. Even if dams receive more runoff, evaporation will quickly erase those gains. Even if rivers swell, the damage to underground reservoirs, soil quality, and natural systems will continue to limit recovery. The crisis is bigger than a drought. It is an environmental, economic, and social transformation. But despite the severity of the crisis, there is still a path forward if Iran embraces reform. That path involves reducing agricultural water use, shifting to crops that match the climate, modernising irrigation techniques, shutting down illegal wells, relocating heavy industry to the coasts, reforming subsidies that encourage overuse, restoring wetlands and river systems, and significantly strengthening environmental governance. None of these changes will be easy, and all will require political courage, economic investment, and public cooperation. But without them, experts warn that some Iranian cities could eventually face day zero scenarios in which water simply stops flowing from taps for extended periods. Iran's drought is therefore not only a story about rising temperatures or declining rainfall, it is a story about human decisions that ignored ecological limits, rewarded overuse, and prioritised short-term gains over long-term survival. It is a story about how policies meant to protect the nation ultimately undermined its most fundamental resource. The crisis now unfolding is the result of decades of choices, some made with the best intentions, but many made without considering the environmental consequences. And yet, if the country chooses to confront the reality with honesty and determination, it still has time to avoid the worst outcomes. Iran's future will depend on whether it can rethink water not as a tool of political messaging or economic expansion, but as the fragile, finite resource it has always been. The nation's history shows that Iranians have long understood how to live within the limits of their environment. The question now is whether modern policies can rediscover that wisdom before rivers, lakes, and aquifers disappear beyond repair. The drought is real, but the crisis lies in choices, and those choices can still be changed.